Like a garden snail leaves a trail behind, a story snail leaves a tail behind. Share our stories and you may find you can tell a story too.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another storytelling assembly. Now, the month of May is a rather special one for us storytellers because it's Local History Month. One of the things I love doing is sharing the stories of my local heroes. I've got a book here called Cambridgeshire Folktales for Children, which has my name on it because I wrote it. And in there are some of the folktales from Cambridgeshire, which is where I live, many of which are obviously not true. I mean, there's a story in there about a boy who can turn into lots of different animals. But there are also stories in here that are true. And I think that some of them are amazing stories. Stories that I love sharing on with folks just like you. And I'd like to share one of those stories with you now because it's a story that can teach us about something called sacrifice. A rather important message, especially when you think of what people were doing in World War II. World War II, you may know, happened between the years of 1939 and 1945. And between those years, it would have looked very different if you were wandering around our country of the United Kingdom, because there weren't many men around. Most of the men had gone off to fight, either in the army or the navy or the air force. But some men did stay behind, maybe because they were too old, or because they were too young or too sick, or because they had a really important job here in the United Kingdom. These were known as the protected professions, jobs that were too important to send those men away to fight. And one of those jobs was being on the steam trains. If you think about it, that was quite an important job during the war, because it was those trains that would collect the bombs and the bullets from the factories and take them across the country to the harbours, where they'd get loaded onto boats and sent off to the army and the navy who would be using them to fight. One of the jobs that you would have on a steam train was the job of the fireman. Now, a fireman is not the kind of man who puts out a fire. No, actually, this was a fireman whose job it was to keep the fire burning, because that's what made steam trains go. In this story, there was a fireman called Jim. And if you asked Jim how long he'd been a fireman, he would tell you, "I've been a fireman for 7 years." Another important job on the railway was the job of the signalman. Now, this isn't just the man whose job it is to make the lights go green or red. His job would be to pull the levers to decide whether the train is going right or left. And in this story, there was a signalman called Frank. And once, Frank and Jim happened to have their lunch break at the same time. And Frank said to Jim, "Would you like to go and get a sandwich together?" And Jim said, "I've been a fireman for 7 years." Which got Frank a little bit confused, so he went off and got a sandwich by himself. Another important job on the railways is the job of the guard. The job of the guard was to make sure that all of the doors were shut so that the train could leave the platform safely. And in this story, there was a guard called Herbert, who once was working on the same train as Jim. And after they'd finished work for the day, Herbert turned to Jim and said, "Here, would you like to go and get a drink?" And Jim said, "I've been a fireman for 7 years." Which got Herbert a little bit confused, so he just went and had a drink by himself. And the final job on the steam train that's really important for this story is the job of the driver. And I'm sure you know what a driver's job is. Oh, but hang on. It wouldn't be the driver who would be turning the train right or turning the train left, because we already know that's the signalman's job, isn't it? Actually, all the driver really had to do was control how fast the train was going forwards or backwards. They were in control of the brake. And in this story, there was a driver called Ben, who would often work on the same train as Jim. And once Ben turned to Jim and said, "Here, did you see that show at the theatre the other day?" And Jim said, "Are you ready?" "I've been a fireman for 7 years." To which Ben said, "Oh yeah, me too. I thought it was a great show. In fact, I'm thinking of going back again this weekend. Do you want to come?" And Jim said, "I've been a fireman for 7 years." And Ben said, "Yeah, of course, that's a great idea. Tell you what, come round to mine and I'll cook." Now you can probably tell that Ben and Jim had been very good friends for a long time. That's probably why they worked on the same train so frequently. But at the start of this story, they were working on a train travelling from a small town in Cambridgeshire called March to another small town in Suffolk called Ipswich. And they were travelling at night because of the Nazi planes that would come over to drop bombs on the United Kingdom in World War II. If the Nazis could see that there was a train, they might be able to guess that it was carrying things like bombs or bullets, things that would be helpful to the British soldiers in the war, so they might deliberately try and drop bombs on the train. So, as they were passing from March to Ipswich, Ben and Jim and Herbert, who was the guard on the train, were travelling very carefully indeed. And as they were passing a city in Cambridgeshire called Ely, Jim looked up at Ben and said, "I've been a fireman for 7 years." To which Ben said, "Oh yes please, I'm really thirsty too. I'd love a bottle of water." So Jim got down from the engine and went into the next carriage along, where there were many bottles of water. And as he reached down for one, he just happened to look up and see, on the roof of the next carriage along, a little fire had started. Probably because some ash had flown out of the funnel of the steam engine and landed on that roof. Well, Jim knew what this meant. If any of that fire heated up the bombs in that carriage, then the carriage could explode. And if the carriage exploded, well, all of the other carriages would explode too. And they were just coming into a little town called Soham. Jim immediately began to panic. He turned round and called over to Herbert, "I've been a fireman for 7 years!" Herbert, of course, tried to ignore Jim and keep reading his newspaper. Well, that wasn't the reaction that Jim wanted. He ran straight out of the carriage past Herbert, jumped into the engine and yelled up to Ben, "I've been a fireman for 7 years!" And Ben immediately put on the brakes, bringing the train to a stop just outside the train station of Soham. Ben knew that if that carriage exploded, the whole of Soham could instantly be flattened. And remember, this was the dead of night. There would be many women and children sleeping in those beds. So Ben, thinking quickly, turned around to Jim and said, "Right, go and get Herbert to help you and unlink that burning carriage from all of the others. I'll then drive it through the station to get as far away from them as we possibly can." Jim nodded. He left Ben at the engine, went back into the guard's carriage and said to Herbert, "I've been a fireman for 7 years!" But Herbert threw down his paper and said, "Look, Jim, I am trying to read. Please do not disturb me with your nonsense any more." And he went back to reading his newspaper. Well, Jim realised if he wasn't going to get any help from Herbert, he was going to have to unlink the carriages himself. So he ran all the way to the end and through the door, which made Herbert get a bit curious. Herbert got up and went down to the end of the carriage to see why Jim had run out the door. And he noticed the fire on the top of the next carriage along, and he knew he had to warn people. He jumped down for the carriage, ran towards the station, and started yelling, "Fire! Fire!" Meanwhile, Jim had climbed all the way around that burning carriage to where the iron link between the carriages was between his legs. Now, these links were really, really heavy. So I don't suppose you could help, Jim, could you? Put your fingers around the iron chain and clank. Whew. Thank you for your help. Now all Jim needed to do was let Ben know that the carriages were unhooked so that Ben could take off the brake and drive the burning carriage out from the station, away from all the other carriages full of bombs. He started climbing back around that burning carriage. Remember, the bombs could blow at any time. He kept on climbing until he got to the guard's carriage. Remember, those bombs could blow at any time. He went rushing through the guards' carriages, past Herbert's newspaper. Remember, the bomb could blow at any time. And he came out into the engine and called up to Ben, "I've been a fireman for 7 years!" And Ben immediately took off the brakes, so off went the train, pulling that burning carriage through the station to the other side. But as they were going through, Jim looked onto the platforms and he noticed people starting to come out there. A few other men, a few women as well, all wondering what Herbert were shouting about. Jim wanted to tell them to go away, so he yelled at them, "I've been a fireman for 7 years!" Now the people couldn't really understand what Jim was saying, but they could tell from the tone of his voice that he was trying to get them to go away. So they turned around and they ran. But then Jim could see people coming onto the other platform as well. So he turned and yelled to them, "I've been a fool!" The explosion of that carriage destroyed Soham train station. But the good news is that Ben had managed to get the burning carriage far enough away that it didn't touch the other carriages of bombs. So the explosion wasn't big enough to destroy the whole of Soham, and in fact, you can still go and visit Soham today. I used to live there. Ben got hit in the back of the head. It was quite a nasty blow, but he was okay. And as he climbed down from his engine, he could see Jim lying with his face down in the dirt. He went over to his friend and rolled him over, and already Ben had tears starting to pour out from the corners of his eyes. He looked down at his friend lying there in the dirt and he said, "Please don't die, Jim. Please don't die. You're such an important man. You've saved so many people today, and well, you're my best friend. We've been friends for I can't remember how long we've been friends." And Jim looked up at Ben and said to him, "You've been my friend for several years. Thank you." And those were the last words that Jim said. But Jim did receive a medal for his bravery, a medal known as the George Cross. And in fact, Ben got that medal too, because both of them had managed to save the town of Soham from the Soham Railway Disaster. And that's why I think those men deserve to be remembered as legends, don't you? If you start telling that story to people you know, maybe one day they will actually become legends. And in fact, if you know any stories about heroes from your local area, start telling them. Local History Month is the best time to do that. Perhaps you can even share them with us so that we can pass those stories on to more people. Right now, though, it only remains for me to say cheerio, and I hope to hear your story soon. So, cheerio! And I hope to hear your story soon.